going to be hosting the Hangout, so we'll have a good one again now that we don't need to depend on Chris Mowdy to run things. But um,
Well,
today,
how frequently are people going to be able to see the old Chris Mowdy and the new Greg Bray on the same show?
that's true. Every time somebody looks at you, they see the old Chris Mowdy, though. So, that's just a factor of how time works. But um, I have to say though, for a 55-year-old man, you do have nice skin. I,
It's supple, very supple. I like to moisturize.
okay, you would. Um, and on that note, we're I guess not starting on topic at all, but this is the pre-show hangout for the discussion on evolution that we're going to be doing come 11 a.m. I'm not sure if everybody had the opportunity to see my teaser promo that I made, but there's a lot of objections that people give to the theory of evolution, and they come from a variety of sources. The reason that I believe most people object to the theory of evolution is that they simply don't understand it correctly. This is something that I'll be addressing during the show more explicitly, but I think there's a fair amount of people that if they simply understood the reality of the theory of evolution, they would have a much better understanding of it, and that is a part of this endeavor in trying to just simply educate people of the facts related to it. They're out there, they're available. As a matter of fact, I absolutely love the website talkorigins.org. It has an FAQ that is marvelous for addressing many of the questions people have about the theory of evolution. The goal, or I guess the other side, though, the other group of people that have objections to the theory of evolution are the ones that are bringing about motivated reasoning to defend their own faith. They feel like the theory of evolution is in conflict with their faith, and therefore, if it is right, then their faith cannot be. I recently attended a debate between Dan Barker and Jerry Bergman, where it was supposed to be on the question, does God exist? And this Dr. Jerry Bergman, he literally has multiple doctorates. Some from or one is from a university that's no longer accredited, and that's the one that tends to get the most attention. But he is a legitimate scholar who is a young Earth creationist and teaches biology at a Ohio college. I have a lot of trouble understanding exactly how that works, but some people are really skilled at compartmentalization. Now, I asked him after the debate why he spent this entire debate on does God exist, arguing against the theory of evolution. And he said, well, because if the theory of evolution is correct, then there is no God. Now, I have to beg to differ on that. I as big of a supporter of the theory of evolution as I am, and the atheist and skeptic and advocate for these positions that I am, I still just can't imagine thinking evolution is true, slam dunk, checkmate, theists, no God. It seems to me to be an insufficient argument, if anything, and therefore I have to also appeal to the massive amount of believers, a good Bible-believing Christians who also accept the truth of the theory of evolution. There's hundreds of millions of them in the world. This is not a small minority of people. In fact, if you look at just the demographics of the United States, only 3 to 11%. I think it's 3% identify as atheist, but up to 11 to 14% now identify as none, no religious affiliation. So we don't really know how they fall. But those people, or the rest of the people, are one of the other small religious minorities. But at least 75% of America is Christian. Now, roughly 60% of America, according to some very trustworthy polls, don't believe, or they do believe in a young Earth. So, admittedly, America is kind of an outlier in this, but globally speaking, most Christians in economically advanced countries do not have a problem accepting both the theory of evolution and their faith wholesale as they are. There's a couple ways to reconcile this. We can get into that more, but this hangout is to just sort of discuss That concept, and also I'd like to challenge, because right now I only have a couple of other atheists in here, unless somebody in the studio chimes in. Um, I'd like to challenge the atheists in here to help me know what have been the most challenging objections to the theory of evolution you've come across. It's something that I've dedicated many years to studying, and every atheist in the world seems to be expected to know how to answer every question about evolution. So I can tell you that even I can't answer all of the questions, and I'm sure there's not a biologist in the world that can. So with that, how are the rest of you guys in the Hangout?
Doing well, doing well. Now, I have to admit that there is still one there's still one argument, and it has to do with bacteria in the lining of your stomach, right? Because if bacteria are examples of quick evolution, right? Because of course bacteria are used, because they make generations so quickly, so you can test, certain aspects of evolution pretty easily with them. Why haven't stomach bacteria evolved? Why are they the same as they've been for hundreds of thousands of years, doing the function that they have, and why haven't they evolved beyond what they are in our lifetimes? If in our lifetimes in a lab we can get bacteria to change to the environment, because our stomach is a perpetually changing environment, right? I don't find that convincing, but when I first heard it, I was like, oh. And the more I thought about it, and of course I did research on talk origins and stuff, but it's essentially the same argument as evolution can't be true because there are creatures that exist now that apparently existed, hundreds of thousands or millions of years ago. You know what I mean? It's essentially like another version of that.
Right. I'm going to write these down because I want to make sure that I address them properly. If you have more questions about it, or give you the chance to give as much of as you can. That was actually a good, succinct way to describe that. Is that it is essentially the same argument as, well, why, explain the coelacanth or explain sharks, or alligators, anything that's been around for a really long time. Look, we have ferns. Ferns were around before flowering plants are, but we still have ferns. It's the idea that evolution means that everything must progress is actually very much a teleological argument, that everything has, there's this great chain of being and a goal for things to get at. Now, the only reason things change is if they have to.
Real quick, Greg, when you throw around words like teleological, I'm going to ask you to break that down into bite-sized pieces, because we want.
That's what I was trying to do with my continuing. That's sort of a purpose, the divine chain of being, or the great chain of being.
So that's what that means when people say things are teleological. Okay.
Right. It means teleological means there's a purpose to it. There's a design. The teleological argument for God is the argument from design. It says that there's an obvious design in nature, therefore there must be a designer. It's kind of the intelligent design argument is.
Yeah, it sounds like the Paley argument, the watchmaker.
Right. Yeah, it's different in a way, because the watchmaker argument is actually kind of going retrospectively and saying, look, there is design, therefore there must have been a designer, whereas the teleological argument is more about purpose than design. Okay. That there's a reason for this, and there's a goal to get to. So that's kind of the difference in perspective from that. But yes, they're similar.
What about you, Kevin?
Well, some of the, I'd say, trickier objections that I've found to evolution, and of course most of them are, the same thing over and over again. We've heard them 100 times. They're well documented on Talk Origins, but some of the more annoying objections I've found to deal with have to do with the genetic code and the origin of the genetic code and information theory, and basically the argument that the existence of information is proof or convincing to these people of an intelligence behind it. I have some background in information theory and computer science, so some of those questions I can address, but in general, and because we don't have a cohesive 100% theory of abiogenesis yet. It's something that it is difficult to address and explain to people why, just because there is this, sequence of information in the genome doesn't necessarily mean.
You were breaking up towards the end there for me, Kevin.
So it sounds like you were sort of making the irreducible complexity, or how do you respond to the irreducible complexity argument that even the simplest form of life...
Not exactly irreducible complexity, but just the argument that the existence of information in the genetic code is evidence that it was put there by some intelligent being. And because we don't have that theory of abiogenesis yet, and there are other interesting arguments that require some knowledge of information theory to this. That's one that I often hear a lot of atheists who are arguing about it kind of struggle with those.
Okay. So in the past, have you come up with any good ways in which you like to respond to that? Any good sources, anything of that nature that has been useful to you?
It really depends on what exactly the person positing the argument is trying to say. I've heard some different variations of it. As a general rule, I try not to engage with creationists on the subject of evolution, though I've been breaking that rule in Hangouts lately, unless they actually express an interest in actually learning about it. Because most often when you get in a debate or a discussion with a creationist about the evolution, they'll come up with an objection. You address it, and then they'll just move on to another objection in the list, usually something you've heard dozens and dozens of times before, and it gets frustrating, and usually it gets nowhere. I'm much more interested in learning understanding why people believe the way they do about it, and usually just addressing the objections isn't going to convince them. It's the underlying belief that sort of has to be shaken first. That's just kind of what I've found.
Is that Dr. Jones? It looks like you sat down for the hangout here.
I love that. I love
joining us.
I'm loving Dr. Arn's shirt this morning.
Right. I like the spray bottle. I'm not sure he's paying attention to us right now. I don't think he can hear us. Can we explain the evolution of the beard? Is that be a fun one? It's interesting though. I mean, that's one that my dad is not a scholar, but my entire childhood, I should say that my experience with the theory of evolution growing up was essentially my dad saying that it's impossible, and my understanding of what a mutation came from the X-Men. I was really excited about mutations and kept expecting to be able to, have superpowers if I were to somehow become a mutant. Turns out that it's generally just cancer. But it's interesting that even through that, my dad's ardent refusal to talk about it is kind of what drove me to learn about it, which I find a bit ironic, and I'm sure is much to his chagrin. But some of the objections that he'd give me were things that I still have a little bit of trouble giving an answer for because they're so specific. That's one of the things that I struggle the most with in theory of evolution, or in sort of explaining it, is anytime somebody comes up with how do you explain this one detail? How did this evolve?
Yes.
The only real answer I can give to somebody on that is I can give you a couple of methods or paths through which it could have evolved. I can sort of deductively determine some ways that make sense or some possible pathways, but that standard creationist objection, you weren't there, it stands true in the same way that historians have to sort of piece together things and come up with different models for what is the most likely, is what we have to do as well. And the beard is one that's great. If you look at most of the great apes, they don't have hair on their face, and even much on their chests, whereas human males, it's kind of the opposite. It's like we just switched that. We actually, humans have more hair on our body, or more of our body covered with hair, than apes do, because they do have more bald spot. For us, it's basically just the palms of our hands and the soles of our feet are incapable of growing hair as far as skin goes. So that's we have grown more. It's just sort of the amount that we grow is reduced in some areas, so it looks like we're bald. Whereas chimps literally just don't have hair on their or around their mouths, so it's weird, and I can't really explain how or why that happened. I would love to be able to give my dad an answer, but that's one he's thrown at me, and still, until I can give him an answer on that, he's apparently never going to accept the theory of evolution. And I'm really hoping someday, somebody will invent a time machine and we can just watch the hair sort of gradually migrate around. But unfortunately, specific details are things that are just outside of the scope of this sort of science.
I'd like to quickly write on the coattails of that point, and then there are a couple comments being made in the comment section on YouTube that I'd like addressed, because it answers your question, right? You're asking specifically about, like, hey, what are the things that you've come across that are super challenging to attempt to answer? And I think that what you just said is really important, because knowing when not to answer is just as important as giving an appropriate answer, right? One of the main differences between creationists and non-creationists is that creationists want a full, complete explanation from A to Z, and non-Christians accept that there are that we're working on very stable hypotheses whose error bars get smaller and smaller as the years go by, and there are certain gaps, but they're not the gaps. They're not like litmus test gaps, like the creationists want to believe, like the aha moments that they keep throwing at us, like Piltdown Man. Like, no, you see, science figured that out. See how that works? Science. And every time science looks under a rock, guess what it finds? More nature. Not anything supernatural, right? So this is a workable model that is a bottom-up approach, and it has some holes in it, and there are some scientific mysteries, like, and I'm going to use that to pivot to a statement or a comment by Ozzy. He says that consciousness and other mental properties are often invoked by creationists as insoluble mysteries that cannot be explained by appeal to evolution by natural selection. So consciousness itself is sometimes used by creationists as like a litmus test, like, can't explain it, therefore it's not possible. And I think we have to get comfortable with, like, yep, consciousness is a mystery. Next.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The appeal to mystery is,
it's basically God of the gaps arguments.
Right, and unfortunately, this is where it comes to the motivated reasoning. This is where I've like to say that there are two sort of competing camps or different camps in this. I think we need to recognize, as sort of not just atheists, but promoters of the theory of evolution, that not everybody who asks a question like that is necessarily going to say, therefore God. But they're often, well, how do you explain this? We can't, therefore I can't accept the theory of evolution. Like, it is a bit more of a, I guess, not always an argument from personal incredulity to drive toward another point, but simply to say, I can't believe this because I can't wrap my head around this particular concept. And there are ways in which we need to be prepared to address that on its own right, as well as addressing why we can't jump from that to a God. Is this? I mean, this is not, I guess, a show about I'm perfectly happy having a creationist on here and addressing their concerns. This isn't a show that's supposed to be creation versus evolution. It's supposed to be answering sort of the objections and the questions about evolution that are common for people to bring up and to encounter. so that people's curiosity can be satisfied, if nothing else. That's because there are answers to a lot of these questions that people simply don't know. I mean, I made the video, and there's the second law of thermodynamics proves that there cannot be evolution, and that one's simple. The second law of thermodynamics talks about entropy, the tendency of things to become more disordered over time in a closed system. And that is a law as far as we're aware. There are no exceptions to that, but the answer to that is, of course, we're not in a closed system. We are constantly bombarded with solar radiation from the sun, and that's obviously the energy here on Earth is all solar energy. Even our fossil fuels is still solar energy. Well, I guess some of it is radioactive coming from the Earth itself, but for the most part, everything that we have has been collected energy from the sun over time, and that has driven everything basically for life to develop and grow. So we're not a closed system. It's actually pretty straightforward in that respect. So there's
the second
so
law,
many different ones.
The second law of thermodynamics and the whole the entropy argument is an interesting one because the word entropy can be used. It's used in two different ways. It's a concept in thermodynamics, and then it also has meaning in information theory. And it's a measure of how much randomness there is in a string of data. But in information theory, entropy can freely increase and decrease. But creationists, they'll try to use the word entropy in reference to, like, how do you get new information? It contradicts the second law of thermodynamics, and it's abusing the two terms, and it's really frustrating to deal with that one. Like, I can explain it, but it's really hard to get it across.
I would sidestep that, and I've used this before. When people that I know haven't studied science, and I didn't study physics, right? Say to me that evolution breaks the second law of thermodynamics, I immediately ask, how many laws are there? It's the second of how many? And what are those others? And then that pretty much shuts them up because I'm like, okay, next.
Right, so this is something that you're repeating without fully understanding even what the objection is kind of what that gets at. I've seen that done in a debate, actually. Dan Barker here in town about a year and a half ago, I went and watched him bring up that specific question in a debate with a creationist, and this creationist apologist couldn't answer the question, which I think is incredibly powerful in a debate where a person is actually appealing to this. The one thing I would caution in that is, of course, we all know that Chris Maude has a particular gift for seeming spineless, if you will, when he's making these sort of challenges. So nobody's offended by him, but it is easy to make a challenge like that and have it come off as sort of snarky. So we got to sort of check ourselves in that we're doing that earnestly and not sort of a gotcha question. Which I think it's funny with the gotcha questions that sometimes it's just a matter of how you ask, not what you're asking. It's, a question can be perfectly legitimate, but if it's the kind where you're tempted to go checkmate, then you're probably not asking it for the earnest reasons here. And that is a fantastic way to address that one, is to just show that the theory is the laws of thermodynamics are a rather complex question. If they don't understand it well enough to even know what the laws are.
Wait, I admit that I don't know up front. I'm just like, so I'm unfamiliar with those laws of thermodynamics. How many are there? It's the second of how many? Oh,
the atheist or the agnostic. I like it. That's an interesting approach too, but that's a different show. So there are 4, by the way, and it's 0, 1, 2, and 3, which is weird. But yeah, that's about all I know about them, aside from sort of what they are. But I did not study that to a great enough degree to answer beyond that. But
well, there's more in the comment section that I'd like to throw out there.
Right.
The last one was from Ozzy. Hey Ozzy, how you doing? And Nemo Utopian, I do think evolution being a truly horrible set of circumstances that seems rather hard to compatibilize with an omnibenevolent God. is one issue for creationists. Let me say that again. I do think evolution being a truly horrible set of circumstances that seems rather hard to compatibilize with an omnibenevolent God. That's a mouthful.
Yeah,
Thanks,
wow.
Thanks, Nemo.
Throwing out the big words there.
The average, like, 6-syllable words there. That was impressive.
So I'm not quite sure where to go with that. Because an all-loving God wouldn't allow the red tooth, very aggressive, survivalist, dog eat dog, animal eat animal life that we propose existed before civilization.
There are some theistic responses to that, though.
Right, and that's what I was about to say there, Bob, is that it's actually something better answered by theists and theologians. So please.
Yeah, well, I mean, for example, there are some who would argue that, first of all, how do we know what a loving God would or wouldn't do? But and of course, that's kind of sidestepping the question, which isn't very satisfying. But there are many people who the way they would interpret even Genesis is not literally but figuratively, and they would see the unique use of particular words, particularly when it comes to making man in God's image, as being so the evolutionary theist who's also perhaps looking at the Christian, and by the way, I'm not one of these, would come up with the idea that, okay, so evolution happened, and it wasn't until it arrived at a particular point in time that God imbues mankind with this image, and that mankind actually becomes the intelligent being that he is at that time. And so all that history was just with animals. It wasn't with human beings suffering and all that. So that evolution would be just that process, and that it wasn't until man the species was ready that he became a human. I mean, that's one of the answers that they could offer to try to get around that, because
I want to note that also simultaneously sort of takes care of the teleological objection, and that this divine purpose is that if God simply put life into play and then waited for something to be worthy of the soul.
Let's see what happens. I mean,
right.
But I mean, I have a problem with that. I don't know that that's something that I would believe. But I mean, who the hell knows what if there is a God? Who the hell knows what he would do, or what his strategy or plan would be, or why it would even be necessary or not? But what I'm saying is that there's enough fudge room, I think, that some theist would see that, well, none of us have all the answers, and I don't know that this is all entirely satisfactory, but at least it leaves some doors open here for that. And I'm not suggesting that we do or don't. I'm just trying to add that to the conversation in terms of the fact that there are theistic responses to that are not as problematic.
I agree. I've actually run into a handful of other ones that I found interesting as well, just to throw them out there. A friend of mine, a Jehovah's Witness who I've spoken with to great length on many of these topics, his perspective on suffering is sort of imagine you're omnipotent and can do absolutely anything. Now, we've all used a word processing program, a computer. Does it do any harm to misspell a word, or to write an entire paragraph and then to delete it and rewrite it entirely? An omnipotent God would literally be capable of allowing all of the history of life to play itself out, and then going back and simply undoing the harm, the negative things, and making it as though they never happened. It's similar to a thought experiment in a human. We can imagine what it would be like if, say, we were to find out tomorrow that there was a zombie apocalypse, and we can play out a scenario in our brains and see, like, oh my God, I might have to kill my best friend, and that could be horrifying. That doesn't mean you actually did it, but depending on how good your imagination is, you might be able to visualize these events actually happening. And if we think of reality almost, this is not the Jehovah's Witness perspective, but sort of one of the ways I've extrapolated it is that we could, in a way, think of reality as sort of a thought experiment in God's mind. It's just sort of him setting a set of rules and letting it happen to see what plays out, and his thoughts become reality to us, but he can always go back and undo or modify or change anything that happens as well. So that's when you introduce omnipotence, you introduce a whole lot of different ways to, I guess, sidestep these questions, or to say, well, it seems like that only from our very finite perspective.
Of course, unfortunately, basically, and I would accuse all sides of doing this. Many times, if we're well seated into it, we can find a way of explaining how that conclusion can still be useful in spite of some of these problems by imagining some sort of a scenario. Unfortunately, whenever any side of the question does that, they're really just defending a position without having anything really with which to do that other than to merely allow for a possibility. And now it becomes merely a mind game of whether or not one can think of scenarios that allow for something.
That's true. It becomes a test of your creativity more than anything else.
Yeah, which
and of
really,
course we have the creativity. There's always the go-to backup on that is saying, well, God's not limited by my creativity.
There's a flip side to that, though, from people who would defend evolution. Sometimes a creationist will challenge a person similar to the way that Greg was describing. How do you explain patterns of facial hair or something like that? And people who believe in evolution, people who've not necessarily studied it, will start spouting out just so stories. Oh, well, maybe there were selective pressures such as this and such as that, and such a mutation might have arisen. And, well, of course, that's entirely possible. But, of course, this is speculative. You're essentially making it up. You're coming up with a story which, if it were true, would explain how something could have evolved. And that's perfectly respectable as a kind of formulation of hypothesis. It's okay for a scientist to do this, to put forward hypotheses and then go looking to test them. But this is not an answer to a challenge when it's put to you. How did it happen? Oh, well, this could have happened. Well, yes, that could have happened, but you haven't established that it did happen. And when people who would defend evolutionary theory against creationist critics do this kind of thing, they end up looking like people who have no respect for actual evidence in science. They look like people that are just making up stories on the spot, hastily trying to defend their position. So I think that when Greg said, well, he tells his dad, I don't know how to explain that, that is in fact what you need to do, because it can be really, you can discredit yourself as someone who actually cares about evidence and scientific methodology if you engage in just so storytelling.
I think, though, there's a degree of that needs to be done. Just so storytelling does need to be done.
We're recognizing that value is limited.
Right. That's where I think it depends on the kind of question it is. If it's a gotcha question, somebody's saying, well, how do you explain that? There's somebody who is looking for what science says about that. They're not asking you to say, give me a hypothetical pathway. I can't even imagine anything that could make this work. So in that situation, the best way to say is we don't know. But if it's a person who, and I guess to elaborate on we don't know, but if it's a person who is just earnestly not understanding, then it makes perfect sense to give them possibilities and say, these are just me speculating, but here's a couple of ideas of how this might have worked. And in that case, it might not only give them sort of satisfaction on that question, but it might also help them understand sort of the predictive power of evolutionary theory and the processes and the ways in which it works. So the other thing is, of course, that's how hypotheses are generated in science. We just kind of have to speculate, and then we go, well, there's one that we can test. So
unfortunate thing is I've run across atheists who will do that, but they won't say, oh, this could have happened. They'll pull something pretty much out of their ass and present it as an explanation and not qualify it. And like when I'll hear things like that, and I'll be like, wait, that doesn't sound right. And I'll look it up and find that we really don't have an explanation for that at all. They made it up, and that frustrates me.
Well, it's all it can sometimes be very slippery, and when we're involved in a discussion, if I have to qualify the character or features present or absent in anything that I'm saying, I can take a sentence, turn it into almost a book, you know. So, but so there's a sense in which we want to give people a little bit of leeway with that, and it's easier to catch the other side doing that than ourselves. But you know, I think I see some limited value in, particularly in discussion of saying things without necessarily qualifying them. But if there's a question of the qualification, definitely bring it up and see where the person might be.
Well, I think a simple qualifier is to simply point out to a person, you know, look, you're challenging me with this question because you think it's impossible to give an account. Well, let me give you some scenarios where how it could have arrived, right? Presenting a pathway, perhaps more than one pathway, and say, so now the problem is we don't know which of these, if any, is true. Perhaps some other alternative is true. We don't know. But what you're trying to do there is explain to the person that there are resources within the model, within the framework, within the theory, that could admit of an explanation of this thing that they think is absolutely a deal breaker for the theory,
Right.
and that's what you're trying to do. But you've got to make sure that you're saying that and that they understand that, because what's funny is I used to be a creationist, and I've talked with a lot of creationists, and what tends to happen is they hear a person trot out a just so story like this, and it isn't explain what they think that they're accomplishing by telling the story, and then these people will then read something. They'll read something by Richard Dawkins. They'll read something by Stephen Jay Gould, where the person is in fact hypothesizing, just putting out possible pathways, and they think, oh, see, that's all that the science consists of, is these just so stories.
So it's important to let that be known. But it's also not necessarily a weakness that I don't have an explanation for something. That's really a question of my skills, of my awareness, and the clarity of thought processes I've gone through. It doesn't really speak to the question itself. There could very, very well be an explanation no one's thought of, or I haven't thought of. But I mean, it is problematic and shouldn't be dismissed. But it is not in and of itself the nail in the coffin.
The other thing that perhaps to point out to someone who says that kind of thing, who raises that kind of objection, you know, you can't explain such and such, is that's true of every science. Every science has puzzles and mysteries that it doesn't know how to address yet, that it might be able to address but hasn't yet, or might never be able to address. But I mean, if that's how you demolish a science, then every science is demolished. They're all equally junk, if that's true. If that's the approach that you take. So obviously it can't work that way. It can't be just a matter of saying, you know, your model can't account for this and you can't give an account for that. Therefore, there's nothing in the theory that does now or could ever explain it. Therefore, the theory is false. All of these are non sequiturs.
Right.
And
everything that science will,
science.
Everything that science will verify in the next 10 years is currently in that category.
Right.
Exactly.
And in many cases, it's currently something that science thinks it's already verified, and they're going to adjust. That's the other thing that is commonly brought up against evolution, is that, you know, well, they used to think this, or you know, it used to be that gorillas were our closest relative, and now it's chimps, and now, you know, next week it'll be orangutans. It's like, no, next week it won't be orangutans, but we're sort of spiraling in towards the correct answer. Sometimes we get a little bit off course, but it's the pendulum is settling in this respect. If you think of scientific knowledge as sort of a plumb bob, it's going to eventually point straight to the source, but it's going to take a little time and wavering in us to refine the knowledge.
It's an ever-refining process.
Right.
I've missed a lot of the discussion, but I have a question. Greg, you used a term earlier, and I don't remember the term.
Was it teleological?
Yes, that's it. Thank you. And you know, that if something is designed, it must have a designer, I believe was the explanation. And I'm curious as to the definition that's being used here, or how you would describe a creationist. Is that someone who goes with what the Bible says about creation, the 7 days and so forth, or is that not restricted to just that?
Well, I've tried to qualify it when referring to creationists, not by simply saying creationists, but when creationists bring an objection, it's sort of, or creationists that bring an objection to the theory of evolution, and therefore, I guess, trying to qualify to which ones are being referred to in that situation. But yes, the term creationist is one that has a very broad scope that it refers to, and there's young Earth creationists that are Genesis biblical literalists, and believe in a 6-day creation with roughly 6,000 years ago, and then there's also the creationists that are old Earth creationists. They believe this is more an intelligent design camp. Now there's variations within this with people who sort of believe that life was created and evolved and became diverse, but humans are a special creation. We're not part of the animal kingdom at all, and this is so there's variations within the theme, but this creationism is overly broad to really use as a clear reference. But I think that generally speaking, when it's being referred to in terms of evolution, it's the people who write books like this one or this one that are Skeptics Answered and The Bones of Contention, a creationist assessment of human fossils, and these are the people who have a motivated reason to object to the theory of evolution or to reject it, is sort of what that is referring to. Does that answer your question?
Okay. Yes. Thank you.
And I wanted to qualify just one more time. The teleological or teleology is referring to purpose and sort of a direction that things are headed towards, whereas the argument from design is more of a retrospective. So they're similar in that, but the teleology it's led to other aspects that have been a little bit uglier, even related to the theory of evolution, and it's been associated with the theory of evolution in a non-religious sense explicitly in some ways, where we look at being as sort of a chain and a process where humans are the top of the evolutionary ladder, and it's really more of an evolutionary bush where everything that's on the outside of it right now is something that is just as evolved as everything else. You are no more evolved than a slug is, which is no more evolved than slime mold. Slime mold is actually really cool for the stuff it can do that we can't.
The expression "more evolved," strictly speaking, doesn't make more sense. Doesn't make any sense.
The only thing that you could say you're more evolved than is something that is extinct. That's because it stopped evolving at that point.
So.
And even that, well, it's extinct, but does extinct mean that it's gone or it lives on through us? I mean, if we could prove that its entire lineage died off, we could say that it's gone. But if it's just no longer around, like something that we killed off, like the dodo bird or whatever, then yeah, okay, that's extinct, and it's less evolved because we've killed it. Kind of self.
You could say you're more evolved than any species in your ancestral line. Although, if you want to,
can't even say that. Things just evolve differently in response to local environments. Things aren't more or less evolved. They are what they are, right?
Well, but I think it depends on how you're understanding the word "more," and that's where more in a teleological sense. You're correct. We're not any more evolved than anything in our ancestral line, but more evolved as in a chronological sense. We've been evolving for a longer period of time.
Then what? Bacteria?
Then there's something that no longer exists in our ancestral. I mean, in this respect, I am more evolved than my parents are, and they're still alive.
Yeah, I was going to go there.
The next level of, on the next generation, and every generation adds new levels of evolution to the previous generation.
An individual can't be evolved. Individuals don't evolve at all, right?
Right,
So,
but my birth was an evolutionary event, is what is. So it was one additional evolutionary event in the chain of evolutionary events that led to my birth. So it's better to just avoid it because of this confusion and say that there's no such thing as more evolved.
Yeah, what we're thinking of is progress when we talk about more evolved. We're smuggling in the concept of progress, which is not. I mean, Darwin actually completely repudiated the concept of progress and came up with a theory of evolution. He didn't even call it evolution because the word evolution at the time implied progress. He called it descent with modification. he insisted that his theory was non-teleological and didn't have any concept of progress in it, and he issued all concepts that would sort of rank things higher and lower. He even said, like, there are marginal notes in books that he's read where you can read it as marginalia, where he wrote things like, say never, higher or lower. He's sort of chiding the person, the author he's reading, because the author is talking about higher and lower species and things like that. He just thought, no, this doesn't make sense. You have to sort of imagine life starting at one point, and it radiates outward in a million different directions. Bacteria have been evolving incessantly for a billion years. Nothing's more evolved than bacteria. If anything's more evolved, it can only be bacteria.
Was basically like I have undergone more evolution than Homo erectus, say. But yes, in general, I cringe a little when people say more evolved.
Well,
I didn't personally go through that evolution.
No,
well,
but even our species.
Our species.
However, I used to be
no
a fundamentalist, and I've gone through considerable evolution.
I think the point that Ozzy is making here, though, and the point that Darwin was making in that same respect, was that we need to be careful about how we talk about things, because it adds to confusion. And if there's a goal in teaching people about a concept, it is to reduce the amount of confusion that they have. So when we use terms like more evolved or higher, or things of anything along that line, we are implying to them. We need to be sort of aware of what they might bring to it. And even though we understand sort of the qualified understanding of it that I hold when I would use that one, I have to recognize that not everybody that I'm talking to, as a matter of fact, the vast majority of people that I talk to don't have that kind of a qualification built into their head where they're sort of slipping into the modern or the common language that I have a tendency to use because it's easier. And I should avoid that because it does just make it more confusing for people.
As a snowball rolls downhill and gathers more snow, as it were, there's a sense in which the evolutionist is really speaking of accumulating variation over time, simply because it's additional, it's cumulative. We're not to say this is not necessarily a development or progress. It's just it is what it is.
Mm-hmm. There's no direction.
Right, and even it's not even always accumulative. Sometimes we can lose information over time because it's we've got redundancies, and it's the weirdest. I mean, this is where
we've lost our sense of smell compared to other animals. Other mammals have much more sensitive senses of smell than we do. The real estate of our brain is taken up with visual.
Compared to other animals.
They also seem to like smells more than we do.
So real quick, the comment section has some really nice comments about this. Bruce Wayne says he loves how one particular creationist uses wolves turning into chihuahuas as an example against evolution, since it became a weaker, less fit. So that's super interesting.
And fitness is something I'm certainly going to address in the next coming talk.
A wolf is not fit for my home. A chihuahua might.
Right. What's great?
Chihuahua might fit in my pocket.
In terms of agriculture instead. That's the example that I like to use is agriculture and domesticated animals that we eat.
Yeah.
Well, there's also a nice comment. Nemo Utopian says, we might still be considered less evolved for past concerns that no longer exist. The metaphorical directionality just is a poor fit to the actual theory.
I love your words, Nemo.
Yeah, I think that's what Ozzy was kind of saying. The directionality, the idea of more, is different than diversity, right? The evolution doesn't lead towards better. Evolution leads towards more diverse. And with that in mind, you can just see things branch out in exponential branches. At least I do. I'm a visual thinker, so that's all.
So are we saying that there's no evidence of actual progress in evolution? It's just what's happening.
Right. Well, progress is kind of a human concept that we're stamping upon it. That it's evolution is just sort of it's best understood as an editing process more than an adding process. The mutation and other ways of adding genetic material like duplication or Very, and we have chromosomal duplication and the improper meiosis and whatnot. But those are ways in which we have gained sort of information and material. But evolution, as far as the natural selection goes, is deleting the stuff that doesn't work. So in that respect, we could consider it to be progress, but only progressing in that particular environment. And it's just best to avoid the concept of progress entirely, because it would need to be so highly qualified that there's really it losing clarity by using it. So you're right, there is no progress in evolution in the respect that most people would consider it. It's just a matter of there's variety in life. There's a population has a great deal of different variety. Look at the different heights, weights, metabolisms, skin colors, eye colors, intelligence levels, athletic ability, and any other metric you can imagine for humans. And think then of an environment that creates a selective force. Say suddenly we have a bird that evolved, or or an alien that comes in and it flies spaceships 6 feet off of the ground with razor sharp blades at the bottom. Weird, crazy concept to add to it. But I'll tell you what, I'd be safe. I'm not 6 feet tall. Other people are either going to evolve a stooped figure, or we're going to kill off all the tall people pretty quick. So that's kind of it's sort of the other analogy I like to use.
That's a very interesting analogy.
The other one is get thrown out of an airplane. If we go,
that is an awesome window into the mind of Greg Bragg.
Yes, it is.
Thank you. So I mean, here's another one: is if we're all on an airplane and the airplane is torn to shreds in the air, but of course around us it explodes away from us, so we are fine, and we're all there in the air plummeting toward the earth. It's very unlikely that any one of us is going to survive, because we're all human and none of us have really any ability to glide or soar or anything of that nature. But I'll tell you what, if anybody happens to have some flaps of skin connecting, like their elbow to their rib cage, that could probably be a little useful for them. It depends on the situation. You either are going to make everything extinct, or something is going to survive, or something is even going to be better at surviving and competing for resources than other things, and we end up with this sort of situation where, by dumb luck, something happens to have something that works well for them, and therefore they do better.
Yeah, that example you give is sort of a catastrophic selective pressure that just raises everything to the ground. It's going to wipe everything out pretty much, because it's unlikely that.
And that's of course not the only kind.
But fortunately in nature, selective pressures are graded. There are very strong, ruthless selective pressures, but there's many more selective pressures that are they're moderate, so that they make a difference with respect to reproductive success. And it's not even true. I mean, people have a tendency to imagine it's all life or death. Evolution doesn't proceed by killing everything off and only the survivors reproduce. No, it's about differential reproductive success. If you have certain traits that are fitness conferring, such that they conduce to your leaving more surviving offspring than those around you, then in the next generation, your genes are going to be better represented than everybody else's. So nobody needs to even get killed off. It's a race for it's differential reproductive success. It's those that reproduce at the best rate. And of course, if you die before you reproduce, well, then you don't leave any offspring. So of course that matters. But even among those who survive, it's differential rates of reproductive success that are making the biggest difference. And the selective pressures that act on that are really quite moderate, quite mild. Just a few percentage points. But over time, those are going to sum up, and you're going to end up with tremendous genetic changes and an accumulation of traits.
And Greg, I think that what you were talking about is really important. I hope you talk more about it. And it's the difference between random and non-random, right? Mutations are random. Like nobody can deny that, right? But natural selection, the environment you're in, selecting for traits that make you more able to spread, increase your genetic imprint on the environment, that's not random.
It's highly
Because
dependent on the condition.
what works works, and that's more pragmatic than random. So I think that's another interesting point that is sometimes used to get back to your earlier question by some people that don't accept evolution. They're just like, how could we have gotten here randomly?
Interestingly, I have actually run across one creationist in a hangout not too long ago who was trying to argue that mutations weren't random, and the proof that he gave was he pulled out like this one paper scientific article that found a species of plant that could sort of somehow had the ability through epigenetics to correct its own mutation. So he extrapolated that to all organisms and was trying to argue that mutations weren't random. It was interesting because it's an argument I just haven't heard before.
Can you state it again? There was some noise while you were saying that, and
there was a creationist in a hangout I was in not too long ago who was trying to argue on the basis of this one obscure example of a plant that could, through epigenetics, like direct its or cause its own mutation somehow. And so he was trying to argue that genetic mutation, was not random, and that all organisms somehow had this ability. It was interesting mainly because you don't. It's not very often you hear unique arguments from creationists. So.
And there's a sense in which it doesn't really matter. What if we someday discover that DNA possesses its own coding, so that when something is under stress, rearrangements can occur based on a rubric? Okay, so what? We don't know that, but there's nothing really to forbid it, nor should we be jumping on that bandwagon. But so what?
Right. We need to recognize that genetics is, aside from sort of Mendelian inheritance and things, genetics is a very, very new field of study.
Yes.
We've got 50, maybe 75 years worth. I think it was 1960 something, 62, that the structure of DNA was published.
50s, I believe,
50s,
late
yeah.
50s, and then it really took off in the 60s and 70s. But yes.
You're talking about Crick and Watson and the double helix?
Yeah.
Yeah, that was late 50s.
Yeah, I'm terrible with dates, for the record. But that.
Well, I'd like to clear the floor, and I think it's time for Greg to begin his talk on evolution, or evolution.
Evolution.
No, it's the evil you shun. That's how it was pronounced in my home.
That's good.
Oh. Okay. Yeah, and the other the thing Ozzy was talking about selective pressures being graded and having a great deal of different levels. There's also different kinds of selective pressures that is certainly something to get into when you talk about sexual selection. Creating really extravagant, crazy. I mean, the peacock's tail is a fantastic example of how powerful sexual selection is, because on a fitness scale, if we're going to talk about fitness. It is another relative term that we like to think about things in sort of the sense of progress, but fitness can mean, as Ozzy pointed out, it's just about your reproductive success. So sometimes having a ridiculously cumbersome adaptation that attracts the opposite sex, but actually makes you way easier for predators to get, can still work out to your advantage in the long run, or to your lineage's advantage in the long run. Again, it's not really on an individual scale. This is where it can really go into agriculture, because sexual selection, as much as it is guided by humans in this situation, has created big, fat, dumb animals that are incapable of surviving on their own entirely. But they're some of the most successful animals on the planet by numbers. That if we have to look at how many cows there are versus how many buffalo there are, or I mean, admittedly we were a different selective force on buffalo, but how many other large wild animals could exist with just regular natural predators are there? We are the only natural predator in the world that farms.
simply keep doing it. That is here. We are attempting to move forward. Once again, we had audio problems, and hopefully everyone in the Hangout and in the viewing audience can hear me this morning, because this is the place for intellectual honesty. We had a bit of a lag, but we're going to move forward in this particular show. We have Greg Bray on the show today. He's a biologist, and he has spent over 10 years just researching, investigating, if you will, the methodologies of evolution and its yield. And I'm very, very proud to have Greg Bray back on the place, simply because I think that he has an extraordinary way of making difficult things so simple. And so, without further ado, let's welcome Greg Bray to the program. Greg, I'm noticing that you have your Superman shirt, or is it Super Greg t-shirt?
This is my Super Greg t-shirt, because I am a superhero. But shh, don't tell, secret identity.
I understand.
Really important.
We also have the unconventional pastor on this particular portion of this show. And so between Greg and Bob and myself, we're going to be talking for about the next hour, and we do have panelists that will chime in from time to time. But we're going to see what we can see, that is through the eyes of Greg. And so, once again, if you have theistic glasses or atheistic glasses or glasses of a different kind, simply take them off and let's put on Greg glasses for the next hour, and let's see if we can see what he sees. But before we start that, let's welcome Bob Graves. He's an amazing, amazing gentleman. Let's welcome Bob.
Hey, great to be here. And I'll tell you what, the last time that we had Greg on an evening place, and he talked about evolution, he really knocked it out of the park. He gave an excellent talk where he covered all the bases that that allowed people who would listen to experience at least the reasonableness. Even if it didn't persuade them, they couldn't find it to be something that was just entirely foolish or backed by just a little few observations that then are accompanied by wild conjectures. He really did an excellent job of nailing it to the floor very well. So I'm looking forward to what he's going to do again today.
I am as well. One of the things that I have to confess, when I was in the 4th grade, I became this person who started looking at the context of evolution, and I let go of creationism at a very young age. And I have found no reason to go back to a creation model. But I will say that after so many years at looking what scientists have been saying about evolution, I'm not completely convinced that I need to park it, that is, in evolution. And that may seem troubling at first, but I don't think that it is. Simply because I think that we have people like, I think his name is Dr. Berlinski.
David Berlinski.
Berlinski, excuse me. David Berlinski. I think that he has quite a lot to say about methodologies. And I think that he and others are questioning, namely the methodologies. And I don't know if I need to put all my eggs in one basket. In other words, I'm more than willing to say, yes, I can look at what people are saying about creationism and move on. I can look at evolution and see how many eggs I can put in that basket. And I don't know that I need to put all of my eggs in that basket yet. And so this is why this show is so meaningful to me. And before we go forward, that is, in the conversation in this show, I want to play this that David actually stated on a particular show. Can we play that clip?
Darwinism provides a mythological framework
Can we start that over? I can't hear that at all.
It provides
because I want everyone to be able to hear what's being stated, because without being able to hear and see, we go nowhere. And so if we can start that over when I prompt it, that would be nice. And so let's see if we can do that. So once again, Dr. Berlinski.
Darwinism provides a mythological framework for a scientific theory. It provides
it and everyone in the okay. We have people working in the background. Greg, before we go to that clip, what are your comments concerning what I said about looking at these different methodologies, that is, in evolution?
The methodologies, I think, are the primary focus that I really like to discuss, and they are so often left behind. Is whenever somebody objects to the theory of evolution or objects to really any bit of science, me being the skeptic that I am, I have this conversation in many different topics and forums. But the methodology is always sort of the key decision point when we talk about, well, okay, so you're rejecting the conclusions of this, but what is your methodology for determining the veracity of your own conclusions and for feeling that the confidence that you feel in the position that you hold? This can apply to, here's a string of controversial issues here. We can go with any sort of conspiracy theory, like the chemtrails or the 9/11 truthers. We can go with things like the anti-vaccine movement, the anti-GMO movement. There's a huge array of different areas in which this applies, but people who criticize sort of the mainstream scientific consensus and say that they reject it are very infrequently willing to offer a methodology for how we can therefore determine things in a different light. And that's where I really like to focus with the theory of evolution, because this is actually one of the most well-supported or best supported scientific frameworks in a theoretical respect of all science, because it's been confirmed through many different methodologies. We have genetics, we have the fossil record, we have the anatomical comparisons of phylogeny, we have ontogeny, and the geological, not just the fossil record, but the geological columns and radiometric dating. All of these things converge on the same conclusions, and the more methodologies we can take to determine a belief, the more confidence we can have in that belief.
Dr. Berlinski has done a bit of pushback, that is, in dealing with this as a mathematician who actually deals with these particular methodologies. It's interesting to see what he is saying. I would like to play that clip right now, because I think that it's going to be meaningful. And by the way, we're trying to get, and I do think that we can get Dr. Berlinski to come on this show, because what we're trying to do is we're trying to be ever so honest. And this is what science is about. This is what Greg Bray is so good at. He loves science. He realizes that at some point in time that a lot of things that we now see or think to be true will be challenged, and therefore we will have to change. And this is the beauty of science and scientific method and modeling. And so with that stated, let's play this clip.
Darwinism provides a mythological framework for a scientific theory. It provides an account of human origins, it provides an account of biological origins, it provides an account of change. And that account at every point is the substitute for a biblical account. That is, the accounts that we had all been led to believe, say, before 1859 were essentially biblical. They began, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Mm-hmm. To be an atheist before Darwin, Richard Dawkins is arguing, would be to leave unexplained the very point that the Bible or the Christian Jewish tradition does explain, the origins of life. In terms of that tradition, the origins of life occur because God breathed upon inert, inactive matter and created life. For the first time, Darwin seemed to provide a framework in which that wasn't necessary. Or more precisely, it wasn't necessary in as far as an alternative miracle was available. That is, the miracles currently being promoted for the origins of life.
It is a creation myth without a creator.
That's right.
All right.
The reason that I wanted to play that particular clip is that not all scientists, and please note this, Dr. Berlinski is not a Christian. He's not a fundamentalist. He's not trying to push theology of any kind. But one of the things that he's attempting to do, he's attempting to deal with modeling. And so he does have some viewpoints, that is, about these methodologies that are practiced in the context of evolution that he does push back on. And so with that said, Greg, I want you to be ever so clear, like, you know, I really don't have to tell you this because you are extraordinary at making complicated things simple. But we have an audience. They need to hear something that they can understand. Not everyone listening has a background like you do and others in biology or mathematics, etc. They need to hear something in terms that make sense to them. And so if you could, for a few minutes, before we get into having a lot of conversation, I want you to put one particular methodology on the table, something that would make sense to, let's say, a creationist, something that would make sense to someone who has studied none of it. And can you do that for me?
Well, I'd love to say that I absolutely can. It's something that I'm not sure that I'm capable of doing in one 50-minute show. That's a very, I guess it's a complex concept to get your mind around in some respects, but at the same time, I believe the theory of evolution is very beautiful in its simplicity. Once we've sort of shed the assumptions that we're bringing to the table, and very often, I think the biggest reason against or people are against believing the theory of evolution is that they just have misconceptions as to what it actually says and what it is driving towards. They're bringing their own sort of biases in the perspective to the table and saying, well, this is what I think evolution means. This is where Ozzy mentioned it in the pre-show hangout, but the arguments from Charles Darwin himself, and in the story, or the book, Origin of the Species, he avoided using the term evolution because even at that time, over 150 years ago, evolution was a term that had a connotation of a progressive scale. We were evolving towards something. Darwin preferred to use the term descent with modification because that is what evolution is, according to modern-day evolutionary theory. Individuals don't evolve. There's no such thing as a person evolving. The only thing that evolves are populations. It is a population genetics question. So that happens because some parts of the population are better fit, and to go into fitness, better fit to the environment that they are in at that time than other parts of the population, and therefore they have greater degrees of reproductive success for whatever reason. There's absolutely no limitations on what kind of reasons those can be. I brought up catastrophic conditions, such as the mass extinction events that have happened in the history of the Earth. But those are rare comparatively, and they are really not that great of examples because it's not how most evolution occurs. That most evolution occurs because of small selective forces that over time drive things in one direction, another direction, or in two different directions. There's divergent evolution. There's also some selective forces that maintain. They keep things more similar to what they're at, because any sort of variation is they're already very well fit to their environment, and variations that come about that are beneficial in that environment are very rare. So it's a difficult concept to describe in that respect, and that's where I think one of the best ways to address the theory of evolution in sort of an introductory method is to go about the common objections that people bring to it, and sort of take them down. Well, I not take them down, I guess, to explain one at a time where the misconception is that's coming about in that. I made a little bit of a preview video for this one, and for that I have a bunch of clips of just me spouting off these different objections, and every single one of these objections, well, there's one that I threw in there that's not, but is one that I have legitimately encountered from somebody who is arguing against the theory of evolution, or in some cases, sincerely questioning. Now, there is a very big difference. I would love it if every person was sincerely questioning the theory of evolution. I have to admit that my own past as an atheist, there was a fair amount of time where my only goal was to argue against theological positions, and now I've come to a point where I just want to understand them better. And I've found it makes the production or the conversations far more productive, educational, and it's far more mutually beneficial and pleasurable for everybody involved. Now, that still doesn't mean that I'm necessarily going to accept their conclusions, but at least I can understand them in the way that they understand them.
Right. Let me interrupt you just for a second, because I want our audience to know that we are very much in concert. I told you before the show, there's no way to go A to Z with this on this particular program. We want to get the conversation started, that is, concerning evolution, looking at method and practice. This is the first hour of this series, and that's the approach that we're using. And so let's not expect Greg to go A to Z. Let's expect Greg to put something on the table that gets the ball rolling. And so I think that that's where you're going to shine. Bob, before Greg starts this and really goes for it, what are your thoughts here?
I'm just right now. I'm curious to see where we're going with this. Again, so although I think the methodological questions are very interesting, I have some of my own problems with evolution, but it's not necessarily the problem of throwing the whole thing out. It's really just the problem of finding that I don't think it's so young that I don't think it has really refined its understanding well enough to be able to explain away all the objections to it, or that it has understood exactly what really was going on. So I found myself in some ways unsatisfied with certain things that some people seem to be very satisfied with. But to me, that's also something which is I find unremarkable.
Greg, take about 5 to 10 minutes and just wow us with something that's easy to wrap our minds around. We have an audience with people who want to see what you're seeing about evolution. So start with step one and walk us through it.
Well, step one, I still think that I need to address a little bit more the attitude that everybody needs to bring into these conversations, because I had a talk just yesterday with a young Earth creationist friend of mine on Facebook, messaging back and forth. He offered to send me a book, and I am absolutely open to reading anything of that nature. I love, again, trying to understand the positions that other people bring, and of course, anytime somebody offers me a book, my immediate response is, well, can I offer you one as well? And then we got to talking a bit more and bringing up some things. He offered me the Ray Comfort film, Evolution versus God, just a YouTube clip for it, and said, would you watch this? And I did. I watched it yesterday. I've heard about it before. I hadn't actually watched it until yesterday. And this film shows basically one question being asked over and over. And the entire point of the film is to criticize the theory of evolution. The problem here being that the question being asked over and over and over is, well, when has it ever been observed for one kind giving rise to another kind? The way that they're defining kind has to do with sort of phylogenetic families, so things like apes or dogs or ducks. That's a very large group where we wouldn't expect a duck to give birth or hatch a turkey egg or something of that nature. These kinds have a fair degree of variety within them, but then they would have diverged so long back that nobody who is promoting evolutionary theory is actually making the argument that anybody would observe that happening today, which is where it is so important to understand the theory that you're criticizing or the position that you're criticizing in a manner that you yourself would be able to present it to somebody else that does accept it as true in a fashion that they would accept, they would agree with the way that you are presenting it. I believe that I can do that with creationism and intelligent design, but my goal with this is to present evolution to other people in such a way that even if you don't accept the truth of evolution, even if you believe it to be entirely false, I hope that you bring to this an open mind and that you are willing to learn what the theory states as a theory and bring that forward from there.
I find it interesting, Greg, you actually did address a point that Dr. David Berlinski raises, and one of the objections he brings to it is that think of all the modifications that would be necessary to turn a cow into a whale. And the step-by-step process and the procedure that it is unfathomable, and just it strains the mind. But what you're actually saying is that the differentiation that led to these two different creatures happened way back, at a point where these differentiations were far more simplistic, and that the sophisticated cow and the sophisticated whale are really two different divergent groups of life that are never to cross paths again.
Right, almost by definition that they're never to cross paths again. That's what many biologists consider to be sort of the definition of a species. And once that speciation has occurred, it's sort of defined in such a way that it's forever different, right? And here's that objection taken care of in the shortest amount of time that I can possibly imagine covering it. So if somebody says, well, I've never seen a duck give birth to a bunny or something of that nature, they're jumping way back, way back, hundreds of millions of years in this evolutionary, well, maybe 100 million years in this evolutionary scale. So the response to that argument is, I've never seen a person jump from New York to Denver, but that doesn't mean that I couldn't walk there. If we both started in Chicago, then we would even be originating in the same place, but there is no way I could jump to get from New York to Denver once we're both at our destinations. So making the argument that you can't make this massive leap is something that nobody is actually stating. And it's essentially the same argument as saying I can walk to my neighbor's house, sure. I can even walk to the neighboring town, but there's no way I could walk to Southern California from Wisconsin. That is what evolutionary theory is stating. It's a gradual, step-by-step walk that takes time. And it's, of course, if you're looking only at the beginning and end points, it's going to look like an insurmountable leap. Or even if you're looking at two end points, then there's not even a logical path that we can necessarily follow for it. But that doesn't mean that it's impossible. If you understand that theory is about diverging in the past and moving forward in opposite directions, or moving away. Again, forward is one of those statements that implies progress, but moving forward through time in whatever way their path happens to take them, as long as their paths may even cross a few times early on, but as long as they're sufficiently separated, then their paths will always be different, and we will have very different results. So it doesn't make any sense to ask for something from for two things from today and say, well, how do we still have this? This is also very similar to the, well, if humans evolved from monkeys, why are there still monkeys around? And humans evolved from apes, which are monkeys. It's a form of monkeys, the old world monkeys, if you will. But even that, the ape family is a fun one. This is a great objection that I actually have a visual for. I may have done this in my last presentation, but this visual here is a handful of different creationists talking about kinds. Again, that concept of family, and saying that humankind is its own kind, and ape kind is another kind. Humans are not apes; they're entirely different. But this chart is showing six different, ancestral or things that scientists believe to be ancestral human skulls, or portions of them. And what they did is ask these creationists to determine, are these human skulls or are these ape skulls by kind? And as you can see, there's absolutely no consensus among these people. So when somebody asks you to present a leap from kind to kind, the very best thing that we can do is to ask them to divide the ancestral fossils between these two groups into which kind it falls, because there's never been consensus across the board for creationists to be able to easily determine, well, is the Archaeopteryx a dinosaur or is it a bird? Well, maybe the Archaeopteryx is easier, but there's all sorts of feathered dinosaurs and even dinosaurs that had hair. There's fish with limbs, or things like amphibians that if you are going just by skeletons, you don't even necessarily see the gill structures. And there's just so many different varieties out there that especially if we look back ancestrally, it is extremely difficult for us to determine which lineage they belong to if they're kind of at that junction where the two lineages vector off from one another. And that's sort of the best way to explain that as I see it. I guess I wanted to go through a series of objections. Is there anything that you guys wanted to comment on with that one here?
I would like for you to do this just for the sake of trying to make this quite simple. Let's take something off the table. Let's take all theological modeling off the table. And let's take off what biologists and others who are very much for evolution, let's take what we are not stating off the table. Let's just go right to evolution itself and start the explanation, if that would be a good starting point for you.
So to explain evolutionary theory, but I already did a show on that one. I was hoping to come in here and explain what evolutionary is. I mean, we have the archives of me explaining what evolution is, so I'm hoping today to explain what evolution isn't, and where the.
I was hoping that you would explain the methodology, like take one methodology and explain that, and then a second one possibly.
So methodology by way of how things actually evolve, or how we know that things evolve?
How we know that things actually evolve.
Okay. Well, and that's, I guess, what I was just speaking to with the different ancestral fossils and having a difficult time determining which lineage that they belong to is one way that we can really well establish that these were at that junction point. But there's all sorts of different ways in which we converge to examine these things. Of course, with fossils, we can only really look at the anatomical structures, but that offers some predictive power. We can say then, okay, well, this was found in this strata in rock with this radiometric date, and we can therefore determine that it's about this old. And if we believe this to be the ancestor of humans and of, we'll say, gibbons, then we can sort of clock back with an approximate time frame and on where we would then predict that to happen. And we can then use this predictive power to look at other aspects like our genetics, because we do currently exist, as do gibbons, and we can look at our genetics, and there's things in our genetic code that simply accumulate with time. things that they will call sort of non-coding DNA. We don't really understand entirely what it's there for, but there's a pretty set rate of mutations that occur in species over time for the non-coding DNA. There's a sort of a molecular clock that we can look back and say, well, there are this many mutations that are happening at, since they accumulate at this rate, and we have this much divergence, then we can track that back to see how many steps it has taken to get where it is. And in those circumstances, we can see, well, would you look at that? The time frames match up. This molecular clock in our non-coding DNA matches up to what we would predict from the anatomical comparisons here. And we can also look at ancestral characteristics and say things along the lines of when a new trait emerged, and then from there go with homologous traits. There's homologous traits means something like, for example, the human hand has 5 digits. We have our thumb that is opposable to the other digits, and then of course the bones and the structures that are involved in it, connecting at a wrist. We've got the radius and the ulna, and then we've got the humerus coming up to construct our entire arm, which we can then look at the structures in other animals and say, well, would you look at that? They have identical bones even. They're different in shape, but the structure, the blueprint, the formula is all still there. A bat with a wing still has a humerus, it has a radius and ulna, it has a wrist and much longer fingers and webbing that connects them, or skin flaps that connect the fingers and the body. But aside from that, a bat's wing is just an arm kind of doing this. And we can examine these to say, okay, well, that's obviously a modification on a theme. It's an ancestral trait being this arm, that we can track that back and say, when did that arise? And we can look at different things in the fossil record for when we first see that trait coming about, and then sort of clock forward from there to say, oh, well, we see this with that trait and this with that trait, and random chance would be extremely unlikely for these traits to evolve independently with such similarity in that sort of time. Now, we have wings have evolved multiple times in the history of life. Bats have wings, birds have wings, insects have wings. And it's very easy for us to determine then that those are not structurally similar in any fashion. I mean, birds' wings evolved after the upper limb did for animals, and therefore it does have many of the same structures that human arms do, because we share that in our ancestral heritage. It all really kind of boils down to the predictive power that we gain from seeing these things arise in the fossil record, and then looking forward phylogenetically. The phylogenetically means in the tree that we'd expect. If this is sort of the branch of the tree in which that new trait arose, then we will expect things from this point forward to have that trait, or have a modified version of it that can sometimes be extremely attenuated, such as our appendix. Our appendix, now, this is one of Jerry Bergman's arguments, is that there's no such thing as a vestigial organ or trait, because vestigial means, in his mind, useless or negative, whereas in the definition of biology, it means of reduced function. Our appendix is the homologous equivalent to the cecum, which is a much larger sort of a pouch on many animals, that it's a part of their digestive tract that helps to store useful bacteria and helps them to digest things. We don't need that because our diet is very different than our ancestral animals that had a need for that, and the other relative living animals that still need that. And we can not only determine that ours is smaller because of our diet, but we can also, again, use that for predictive power. We can say, well, if something has a... Sorry, I saw a comment from Ozzy there. I'll address that in a moment. But if something has a cecum, it will very likely have this diet. And if something has something more similar to our appendix, it will very likely have this diet. We can make predictions based on the anatomical structures that we see arising and how evolution would have shaped that structure, what kind of forces would have driven it in that direction, and make predictions based on things that we have seen in other organisms. This is an extremely useful aspect of evolutionary theory, that we can actually come up with ideas about something that we know nothing about. If we find a new jawbone from an animal that's recently dead, but otherwise an unknown species, we can look at that jawbone and determine, is it a mammal, is it a lizard, is it a bird, is it a turtle? We can have all sorts of different inferences from that, but then we can also go, well, what would its diet likely be like? It's amazing what we can determine from just a single bone in an animal. Particularly jawbones are incredibly useful because we then have the teeth, and those have uses and things that are very strongly selected. And it's just marvelous the amount of things that evolutionary theory allows us to understand through prediction and then verification.
This is the thing that I think you are so awesome at, and if I distracted you away from what you had planned, I do apologize. But I wanted people to hear that this Greg Bray that we love so much and think so much about, you have the ability to not just read your notes. You have the ability to, shoot from the hip, because this is something that you have researched very well. And you have the ability to explain these things. And this is what I wanted people to get a touch of. You're doing an awesome job right now, Greg, and I'd like to thank you for allowing me to distract you away from what you had actually planned. And I do apologize if it took you off guard, but my intention was to say, this guy, Greg Bray, he's brilliant. He has the ability to talk about this in a reasonable way, and here is why Greg thinks this is true. He's not trying to go outside of his discipline. He's trying to keep everything within the context of his discipline, and he's wrestling with these issues, and this is why he thinks that evolution would be the best explanation. Am I wrong about any of what I just said?
I like to think that I'm very intelligent and sophisticated, so obviously those aspects were correct. I did want to bring up just a bit of terminology that Ozzy was kind enough to remind me that I missed saying. I mentioned homologous traits are things that come about with the same structure, and we determine from the structure that it is almost impossible statistically for that to have not come from an ancestral species. I mentioned then the different times that wings have arose, such as insect wings, bird wings, and bat wings. Those are what are called analogous traits. Things. Other similar examples are the streamlined shape of a dolphin and a fish, or the let's see, some of the dentition is another one where we've seen the different sort of grinding teeth come about in different respects. And there's Ozzy's bringing up eyes are another great example. The human eye is a product of our own evolutionary history, and it shows with things like a reversed retina. Our retina, actually, the optic nerve comes through the back of the eye, and then it attaches to this face of our retina, and the light shines through our retina, and the cells that sense the light are actually on the other side of it. And that's true of mammals. It's something that there's just we will see this homologous through all mammals because that's the way that their eyes evolve. But invertebrates, things like octopi or octopodes. I'm sorry, I just learned yesterday that I was using the wrong, because that's Greek, not Latin. But the octopodes, cephalopods, have a completely different eye structure. It's far more efficient in that respect than ours because the optic nerve attaches at the back, and the retina faces forward, and it has very obvious different origins. Now, the insect eye is, of course, extremely different from both of those. They have segmented eyes, and they'll have dozens of dozens of little aspects of their eyes. Arachnids have many eyes. There's all sorts of different ways in which we can look at these and say, well, obviously then having eyes must be extremely useful ancestrally. And it's great if you ever want to look into eyes, because that's a very common argument. Just YouTube search the evolution of the eye, and there are some awesome videos out there that sort of demonstrate how this could have happened and why it could have happened. Because imagine in a world of total darkness where nothing has the ability to sense light in any way, shape, or form. Is there any plausible fashion in which sensing light may have a benefit to us? Well, things like if you have the ability to use photosynthesis, then of course the ability to sense light and move closer to light is certainly adaptive. Plants can do this in a completely different fashion in the way that they grow. It's called phototropism. But if you're capable of moving around the way an animal is, or bacteria is, then great. It's really useful to have photoreceptors and be able to move towards the light. So even just a single photoreceptor on each side of your body is enough to tell you then where the light is and steer you towards it. You don't need to be able to see anything, just get this general feeling that there's light. But of course, the more of those you have, the more exact this gets, and the clearer the picture will get. Structures change over time, and every time a structure changes in a beneficial manner, it's going to give you a huge adaptive advantage over your competing brethren in your population. If you can see better in any case as a predator or a prey, you're going to be far more successful than the ones around you in the cases where you have to catch or get away from food or get away from predators. So eyes have arose multiple times, and for very good reason. They're very useful, and the ability to sense light in a world where light is abundant is incredibly useful, and therefore we've seen it arise in multiple different animals over time, and we can tell very easily which ones came from which lineages. And that predictive power, once again, is where the methodology of the theory of evolution gains its power, is that we can look at the structures of the eyes and say, this gives us a phylogeny for these animals. It gives us a prediction for what their ancestral relationship is. Of course, the eyes are one trait we can do that with. We can do it with the skeletal structure. We can do it with jawbones. We can do it with all sorts of other things. And the more different aspects we analyze these traits and their sort of phylogenetic history, the more certain we can become about how these trees work. And then we combine that again with genetic information. And I brought up the genetic information in non-coding DNA, but of course non-coding DNA is still subject to sexual rearrangement and crossover and things. So another great thing that we have is mitochondrial DNA. All of our mitochondrial DNA comes from our mother. It is there is no mitochondria in sperm. Therefore, the DNA that we carry in that is not subject to any sort of sexual recombination. It is entirely matrilineal. Same with the Y chromosome in men. Every man has a Y chromosome that came from his father. Now there is some crossover and things that can happen with the Y chromosome, but for the most part, we can track these back and say this is the lineage based on this rate of mutation that we know and we can observe and say this happens this frequently, and clock back and look at the mitochondrial DNA in this organism and another organism and say, well, obviously they have 300 mitochondrial mutations. That on a clock back leads us to, and I don't know the rate off the top of my head, but it leads us to this date. And now we look at that date and we determine that, in fact, that we see an ancestral fossil that shares traits with the two of these and no others. There's so many different ways in which we can use multiple different sources to verify the history. That the fact that we weren't there and we didn't see it means almost nothing. As a matter of fact, being there and seeing it probably just would add to the confusion, because we'd have to live for thousands of years to see anything really productive happen. So it wouldn't really gain, or we wouldn't really gain much information in that. It happens at the population level. We don't have the ability to track entire populations in that respect. So we can't observe that, even if it is, and it is happening now, we're not going to be able to know that a species is diverging into two different kinds of animal for probably about 10 to 75 million years. So if we want to stick around and let that experiment run that long, we can probably determine that. But if you don't have that kind of time, and I know I don't, then we have to be a little bit more willing to use some deductive reasoning, some forensic evidence, and examine these traits with the probabilistic understanding that adds to all aspects of science.
Greg, could you speak to the horse, mule, donkey differentiation and how that fits into speciation?
You mean the fact that they're able to produce offspring?
Oh, that are not able to produce offspring, right?
Right. There's actually many things in the horse family. Is it ungulates? I think that's deer. I forget what the today. But the family in horses includes not just donkeys and horses, but also zebras are in there, and you can get a zorse, a horse with a zebra, or a zonkey. They are related to each other closely enough to be able to combine their genetic material in a way that will produce an offspring. Now, in every case I've heard of, at least, they have produced non-viable offspring, meaning that their offspring. I'm sorry, they produce viable offspring, offspring that can live, but non-fertile, infertile offspring. So it's something that they're similar enough that you can make an animal by combining the two of them. You can do the same thing with lions and tigers. It's another way that demonstrates how they share in evolutionary history. The further you get back away, or the further the separation is, the less likely a crossbreeding is going to be able to produce any sort of offspring. And the more recently it is, the more likely it'll be able to produce viable offspring. This is how divergent evolution occurs, is by generally separating one population into two populations and simply allowing time and to take its course. Now, we've talked a lot about selection, and mutation. There is a third force in evolution called genetic drift, and that is another completely random force. So mutation and genetic drift are random. Selection is entirely non-random. But genetic drift is saying that in any sufficiently large population, things are going to sort of sway one way or another with traits that are rather neutral in selective forces that don't have any real advantage or disadvantage, say in some examples coloration or height, or it depends entirely on the species, but they're going to change and drift in directions that are entirely unpredictable, and therefore they call that genetic drift. So if you separate one population into two populations for long enough, and even keep them in identical environments, genetic drift will eventually make them look and be genetically different. Because they've been in extremely similar environments and haven't gone through other selective forces, there's a far greater chance that if you recombine those populations, their genetics will recombine, and you will once again have a single large population that's just more genetically diverse than it was before. Whereas if you subject them to selective forces, you end up with things like a Chihuahua and a Great Dane in the dog family, that in nature a Chihuahua would be a snack to a Great Dane, not a breeding partner. So there's plenty of ways in which we can force still a Chihuahua to produce or reproduce with a Great Dane through artificial insemination, and I'm not even sure if that would lead to a viable offspring. But we can certainly do that with all sorts of different currently existing species or subspecies, or even just groups that we've created, like in the dog example. But that doesn't mean, I guess, and in fact, it actually lends credence to the concept of divergent evolution over time. It doesn't mean that these are obviously the same kind, because even within the kind, if you track back far enough, we are completely, or you'll find them where they're incapable of breeding at all. It's just a matter of how recently and how big of a genetic difference there is. There's also events with frogs where literally in a single generation you can have a complete species separation. Here in my local area, I've done research on the frogs, and one species of frogs, well, there's two species. There's the eastern gray tree frog, and there's Cope's gray tree frog. Anatomically, they are almost impossible to tell apart. I could not tell you, if you catch two of them, which is which, and you put them in front of me. You can tell by the frequency of their calls, if they're both calling in the same area on the same night, because they're temperature dependent things as well, but you can tell by that, by the sounds that they make. But aside from that, the best way to tell which is a chromosomal squash, because Cope's gray tree frog has twice as many chromosomes as the eastern gray tree frog. This is a tetraploidy event. Its entire genetic code was duplicated in a single generation. This was a error in replication in the mother's germline, and she was able to produce viable offspring that had twice as many chromosomes as all the other one. They could only breed with each other. This was a speciation event literally overnight, and they cannot breed with any of the other ones, but it's been a successful breed, or a successful species, that is forever and irreconcilably different from its ancestral species that currently coexists with it. That's doesn't mean that any two of them collected would not look like the same kind in every respect. But did that answer your question there, Bob? You're muted, so I'm just taking your nodding as yes, Greg, you're awesome.
You're awesome. Yeah, no, yeah, that addressed it. Yeah.
Okay.
And in fact, I would say that the frog example is something we could have waited around 1,000 years to see. We just happened to be there at the time.
I do have one theological question to ask you before we bring the Hangout back in. You've done a wonderful job. I've really enjoyed your explanations. I'm looking forward to hearing much, much more, to be honest with you. Tonight's going to be a wonderful show because we're going to have theists pushing back. That is, people who think that creationism has a much different model. And so it's going to be interesting for Greg to field questions and trying to keep theists honest about the meta-language of biology. And I'm going to be all ears. I applaud what you're doing, Greg. You've done a wonderful job. But here's my question. It's a theological one. Let's, just pretend like the writers of the Bible were writing something about something that actually took place, where the daughters of men and the fallen angels had sex with one another, and out come giants. Can you explain that?
Sort of speculation that I've done in the past as well, talking about the potentials for how we could have the genetic diversity that we have from a single breeding pair in the time of 6,000 years. That's Ken Ham's model of creationism, and actually it's 4,300 years. It leads us from a single breeding pair of most kinds of animals to all of the genetic diversity that we have today. So there's only one way that we could reconcile that, and that would be that these have some sort of super DNA, and that the information is being divided. So say we'd expect these ancestral species, maybe the humans and the angels, to both being creations of God, to have similar enough DNA to be able to interbreed. But of course, with different variations among them, and I'd imagine that this is probably no longer possible due to the specialization that's occurred in both angel and human lineages over the last 4,000 years. So in this time, or I guess 4,400 years, and this, when we're talking on that scale, it's probably important to include that 400 years. So over time, with this super ancestral race of humans, the lineage of Noah obviously must have contained somewhere about, I'm guessing, 1,000 copies of each chromosome, and then when they reproduce, they simply butt it off instead of diverging in such a way that they're sharing, a copy of the chromosome. They're just giving away one. That would be the way to miraculously maintain the genetic diversity that was there. Same must be true for Adam and Eve, is their children, or perhaps they divided their genetic material among Cain and Abel, so each, that would be a really bad.
Thanks for going along with the pun. Let's bring our hangout back in. I'm interested in hearing the questions and comments from Ozzy and others. Ozzy, are you there?
Yes, I am. Thank you.
What do you think about what Greg is articulating?
Well, it's terrific, and I've been learning a lot. I was especially intrigued by that story about the Cope's tree frog. I'd never heard that story. It's fascinating. And as Bob said, it's remarkable that we witnessed, we actually were able to see this. It's one of those things where if you don't have the good fortune of seeing it, you're going to be scratching your head wondering how could this have happened.
Well, I do have to say that we didn't actually observe that speciation event happen overnight. We just have determined. This is again, they're abundant enough in the area that it must have happened within the last. I don't know if they've tracked back when the divergence occurred, but it would have happened within the last couple hundred or 1,000 years for them to have been able to spread as much as they have.
Yeah,
but
no, that's what I mean.
Very recent.
That's what I mean by it's observable. I mean, if this had happened, 500,000 years ago, a million years ago, it would have been so much evolution between these lineages, or within each of these lineages. They would have diverged in so many ways. They would look very different. This happened, or evolutionarily speaking, so quickly. It's as good as happening before our eyes. Of course, nothing in evolution happens before your eyes. Nothing can happen before your eyes. But I was intrigued by something earlier by that fellow Berlinski that he said. I wonder if I could address that.
Certainly.
He was talking about evolution, and he was talking about evolution as a mythological account, saying that evolution explains what, just trying to re-explain what the Bible explains. And it's true that the Bible explains things, but it explains things in the sense that Greek myths explain things, in the sense that it's a story. The Bible tells us a story of origins. And science, as Berlinski says, tells a story too. But it's not just a story. It's a story massively supported by evidence, multiple and independent lines of evidence. A story that isn't only supported by that direct evidence. It's a story that's indirectly supported by the fact that it fits neatly with, or it dovetails with the rest of the natural sciences, completely indirectly. So you get this consilience of completely independent lines of evidence. It's completely different areas of science that converge on evolution. So yes, evolution is a story of life and how it arose, but it's not just a story. The Holocaust is a story. So is Little Red Riding Hood, but there's a difference here, and the difference is a question of the evidence for it and how well it nests with the rest of the things that we know. And so I think that this type of talk about evolution as another myth, just another story, is a disparaging way of talking about a science. So there are stories, and then there are stories, and I think evolution isn't merely a story.
I really want to get into some of the substance that Dr. Berlinski is actually putting on the table, because in a sense, Ozzy, what he's saying is that the methodologies that are pontificated in the context of quote-unquote evolution are not true scientific methodologies. And he says, states, and I'm paraphrasing here because I certainly want him to speak for himself, he feels like there is much interpolation, much reading into it. And so in a sense, he's saying that there's really no difference between reading into that than, you know, the kind of stories that we find in the Bible, because he's certainly not a Christian or any kind of person like that. And he does have quite a background in mathematics, etc. And so when you look at the data that he has provided concerning the conversation, to a person like me, it raises some questions about how we are interpreting the data. You know, when we say evidence, it's not just about saying the term, it's about how we interpret the evidence. And this is a concern of David very much. And so I'd like to explore a little bit of that tonight, if you would be willing.
I'd absolutely be willing.
Yeah, because I think that, Bob, you were able to see some of the videos that, or some of the conversations that David Berlinski has made on various shows. What are your thoughts concerning David's chats?
I haven't heard enough of him, and I don't possess the kind of a background to fully assess. He certainly asked some of the same questions that I ask, but he does raise questions about methodologies not being able to demonstrate to us exactly how some of this was implemented, you know, and that he feels there's huge leaps. And of course, I think there's huge leaps, but then again, I don't know why. For example, he talks about, and here's something where I think that perhaps evolution has something a little bit wrong. We see significant shifts in the organisms that occupy the planet. Whereas if evolution is correct in the way that evolutionists tend to talk about it now, we would expect to see something that was more gradual. And but rather we see sudden changes, and so this is, you know, a question that he asks, you know, what's that all about, and what's going on, and can evolution explain those sudden changes, where it's not just a sudden change in a particular species, but a sudden change for the entire planet, as if it had started all over again with a completely different set of DNA. But you know, so he raises some interesting questions, but I am not personally really qualified to assess the value of them, or how they apply, or what supposedly would represent excellent answers for them. But perhaps Greg would do us the favor of looking at several of David Berlinski's videos and get a sense of where he's coming from and offer us some responses. He'd be far more qualified to do that than I am.
What I'd like to do tonight is to play some of what he's pushing back on. I don't think that Dr. Berlinski is attempting to say that evolution isn't something worth looking at. I think in a sense what he's saying, and I may be completely wrong here, Ozzy, I simply think that he's saying that, you know, we know that the biblical account is all mythology, and yet evolution may have its mythologies as well, you know, to a lesser degree. In other words, he's simply raising the question, are we really willing to put an end mark here and say, oh, we have it now, or are we willing to say that maybe a lot of these things are still in the context of a leap of faith? And I think that's what the majority of his concerns are. And so I don't want to make more out of Berlinski than what he's suggesting, but I'm simply saying that He's an awesome scholar. He says a lot of things that I do not understand. I think that Greg is qualified to address many of the things that he's stating, as well as you are, Ozzy. I would love to hear your explanations and push back on Dr. Berlinski, because you're more than qualified to do so.
It goes without saying, I think, though, that they need to listen to him for themselves, because I don't understand him well enough to actually represent his objections in the particular vein that he would. So, but I found him interesting. But what was particularly interesting about him is that he has scientific rather than religious reasons for having a real problem with the overall story. Nor is he's not necessarily even denying that there's something like evolution, but that he thinks that they're a long way off from explaining a lot of things that need. There's got to be a lot more to the story than what you're hearing, and this has got to be some small part of it. But it would take listening to him for yourself to actually get.
I agree. I agree. One of the things that I think that is poor is that many theists have pulled Dr. Berlinski into the context simply to badge their creation models, and I think that's extremely poor. This is why I said at the beginning of the show, I'm not a quote-unquote creationist at all. I became one who was looking at and was convinced that that evolution is the best explanation. I haven't really changed my mind on that, but I'm willing to look further. That is, if people have better methods and practices. And so my question is to all of you guys, Greg included, if someone like Dr. Berlinski or say Joe Schmo came along and has a better method and practice, would you be willing to move on?
Absolutely. Yeah. This is something that I intended to mention at the beginning of the show, and I didn't have the chance to, or I forgot to. I mentioned the debate that I attended, and the book that somebody offered to send me in that conversation. But there was one other conversation I had on this previous Monday. I went to an event, a local event that was Heaven's Gates or Hell's Flames, held by a local church, and it's a dramatization that has sort of videos integrated into it, and I took 6.5 pages of notes about it. It was a lot of fun, but I had a conversation with a lady afterwards who I'd actually met once before. I attended there's an event that goes on there called Alpha that I attended once as well. I jumped into it on the 3rd week, so I determined I'd go back next time it started, and I have missed the start date every time. So, but I try to get involved in these different things locally, if for no reason other than to educate myself about sort of the different perspectives that other people have from those people themselves, but also to Ozzy, it looks like you're interested in Alpha too. Excellent. It's also to represent sort of the other side that is frequently talked about at these events. Similar to the way that it would have been advantageous to some extent if we'd had a creationist, if we were going to talk about the beliefs put forth by creationism, to say, well, that's not entirely accurate as far as what we say and how we say it. Now, it's not necessarily useful to have a creationist talking about evolution. It's better to have an evolutionary biologist talking about evolution. But I certainly don't feel that I would be qualified to accurately represent the views of any particular creationist in every fashion, and I'd love to have them there to correct me if I say something wrong. I've dedicated myself to saying it as accurately as I can, the way that they agree, but with time, we'll see that happen. So, anyway, conversation I had was with a lady that runs this Alpha course, recognized me before, and she asked me point blank what was a incredibly useful and powerful question. It was, so, what is my motivation? What benefit is there for me if I accept your point of view? And I said, well, that's a very good question, because of course the benefit is something that we'd need to have if we were going to do it, I imagine, but benefits are determined by our values. So I have to ask you first, what do you value? And she said, well, I value love, I value family, I value eternal life. And I said, well, then for you, there's really not much of a benefit to switching to my perspective. That's really not going to work out well for you if that's one of your top 3 values, because I don't believe that we have eternal life. But the benefit to me is that I value truth. I value the knowledge or the confidence that the beliefs I hold are as accurate to reality as possible, and that is the benefit to having these conversations. And in that, I guess, to respond then to that question directly that you asked, Dr. Jones, is that because that is my value, anytime anybody were to present a method or a model that has a higher fidelity and is demonstrably closer to or better at getting close to what reality actually is, I will absolutely take that on and embrace it with everything that I have. It scared the crap out of my wife, though, I have to say.
I'm like Bob in this context. When I read, and I did buy some of Dr. Belinsky's books, etc., and I've read many of his articles in the last 24 hours, many of the things that he was stating were simply not understood by me. I need someone who can interpret what he's attempting to say and explain to me why he's wrong, challenge his notions, and that's what I need. I actually sent you and Ozzy actually one of the clips, many clips that I've viewed here more recently, and this guy doesn't seem like he's a dummy in any sense of the word, and he doesn't come without, raising some questions that have raised some questions in me. And so I think if we're going to have a conversation, let's open up this conversation as wide as we can, because I think the conversation needs to be not about, quote unquote, whether the Bible is true or anything like that. I think that we need to look at evolution and to see these methodologies for what they are and tightly or put them into a model of criticism. One of the things that I have been thankful for is getting involved in textual criticism, higher and lower forms of textual criticism. And I criticize the Bible all of the time, but I think it's time that we also are honest enough to criticize, and I don't think that this is not being done. I think that we need to criticize our own disciplines. And I'm not qualified to criticize biology, but you are. Ozzy, you're very qualified to criticize most of these things in philosophy and biology. And so I'm asking you guys to help me out. I want to explore it a little bit further. I need someone to help me. I need someone to put between my left and right ear something to think about, something that will challenge my way of thinking. And so would you guys take the time maybe this afternoon to look at this, and maybe we can further the conversation a little bit further this evening?
I'll do everything in my power to.
Yeah.
Okay.
I have to say I'm not real familiar with him or his arguments, but I've done a bit of research, I guess, in the background here to find, I guess, sources. Not haven't actually looked into them
as
yet.
Far as Berlinski goes, what is your? This is more directed at Dr. Jones. What is your? What does he see? What direction does he seem to be going in? How he criticizes evolution, like philosophy, mathematics? Does he go right after the biology, or math? I can do a lot
he's arguing that we don't know what direction to go in, and that we've headed in the wrong direction. But that maybe we need something better than this. I think that's what he's suggesting. Right. He's not suggesting we go back to creationism.
Right.
No, he's a fellow at the Discovery Institute, it looks like. And the Discovery Institute is a intelligent design think tank. So it's not creationism in that respect, but it's the newest iteration of creation science.
He's probably just a consultant. He's certainly not a believer of any sort.
No.
Well, the Discovery Institute is not officially a Christian organization of any kind.
That's a huge can of worms by itself.
Can be.
Dr. Jones.
Great.
But I'd be glad to answer your question concerning Dr. Belinsky. Some of the questions that he's raising, regardless of whether he's a theist or not. I don't know that he is a theist, and if he's working with some people on modeling intelligent design. I don't know that to be true. It may be true. I don't know. But what if someone in that community has some things to say about mathematics and possibly molecular biology that may be useful in this conversation? And I'm just asking for people who do have the credentials to talk about this, to explain some things to me, because I'm not capable of assessing many of these things that are being stated. I've heard many of the things that he's suggesting. It doesn't appear to me that he's trying to reinvent a creation model. I think that sometimes people get upset with me because as a linguist I may work with some Christians on linguistic models. That doesn't mean that I'm a Christian. I'm just trying to clean up their act in the context of linguistics, trying to say, hey, if you're going to work efficiently with something, you need to do it this way. And it may be true that Dr. Belinsky is simply trying to say, if you're going to work with mathematical yada, 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 work with it this way. I don't know what his participation is with that. And so I can't simply mark him off and say, well, you're in with these intelligent design people, and so therefore you must be one. NCG is all about having atheists and theists together, and people call
NCG
me,
has a touch more integrity in its methodology, though, I have to say.
Well, thank you.
The Discovery Institute is it is a very, very, very well-funded. It's a think tank, but it's a lobbying organization specifically oriented around. I mean, I did research into this organization in my undergrad, and it's specific. I might even still be able to find that research paper and publish that for you.
But here's where I'm
written
at,
as like a
Greg.
junior in college, so it's not.
This guy may be blowing smoke, but sometimes I just don't know if he is, simply because I need someone like you to explain this. And Ozzy, are you still there?
Yeah, I am, and I'm not familiar with his work. I've heard the clip that you played earlier, and I was responding to that. That I thought that he was adopting a very sort of disparaging and needlessly reductionistic characterization of evolutionary theory as a story and as a myth, and as a narrative. These are ways of sort of putting down a scientific theory. But that doesn't mean that there aren't genuine problems with the theory that he's identified. I mean, this would not be the first time in the history of science that someone has pointed the finger at a theory and said, there's something really wrong here, and not enough people are taking notice of it. If anyone's familiar with the work of philosopher of science Thomas Kuhn, wrote a famous book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, and he says that science proceeds by, not everyone agrees with Thomas Kuhn on this, but his view is that science proceeds through what are called paradigms. There's a general model or theory that describes not just the phenomenon, but what are the legitimate questions that need to be addressed within the particular domain of science that science is looking at, and that it defines the methodologies. And within that paradigm, people are essentially doing puzzle-solving work. They're just sort of grinding away, trying to answer all the little questions. And then, of course, anomalies arise, and then the expectation is that within the resources of the paradigm, you'll be able to answer these questions using what's in the paradigm within the general model. But eventually, the anomalies can grow numerous enough that people coming into the field, some of them will seriously question and challenge the paradigm, produce an alternative model that is not anywhere nearly as well corroborated because it's in its infancy, but it addresses some of the concerns that are not being properly addressed, that are recalcitrant problems in the old model. And what can happen is people coming into the field have to sort of look at, is the old model kind of gotten brittle and stayed and not advancing, and there's a more fruitful avenue over here, and eventually that can result in a paradigm shift. So science, in fact, can proceed this way. So it's possible that someone like Berlinski is identifying what he thinks as recalcitrant problems that cannot be answered properly with the resources and conceptual tools within evolutionary theory, and that something else is called for. I don't know if he's proposing something, an alternative, or if he's just pointing to what he thinks are problems that are really intractable, that can never be solved.
If I can point out just...
Yeah, go ahead, Kevin.
Looks like he froze up.
As far as his theological background, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
All right. Yeah, he defines himself as a secular agnostic. He comes from a Jewish background, and says he refuses to speculate on the origins of life. Just reading from, I don't know a lot about him either, that's why I'm asking, but just reading some of the things that he said about evolution, it's definitely setting off some alarm bells. He doesn't seem to really understand what he's talking about, but I will definitely look into him a little more and see if I can address some
That's
of
what I
this.
was about to say too. Is that he has a PhD in philosophy, and it looks like he's got a fair amount of postdoctorate with mathematics as well.
Yes.
So there's a very good chance that he's approaching this from sort of a philosophical direction of saying, one, evolution can't account for the origin of life yet, and therefore saying that we have to sort of speculate on some sort of abiogenesis, as if that is an absolute for the theory of evolution, which frankly the theory of evolution does not depend on that. That's just sort of a necessary precondition for evolution to happen is life needs to exist and reproduce in certain fashions. So that's actually a separate question that is often sort of conflated into the theory of evolution because it's very strongly related. But he also, he makes a lot of arguments that represent, as I see it, a fundamental misunderstanding of what the theory of evolution actually states. I always am a little hesitant to see anybody, any credentialed person that is coming out, with his philosophy and mathematics and coming out against biology.
Can I say something to that, though?
Yeah.
Okay. You don't have to be in a field to critique it. You just have to understand the field to understand it. And let me give you an example that happened in Darwin's day. It didn't work out. It actually worked out well for Darwin in the long run. But I mean, when Darwin put forward the theory of natural selection, he didn't know about what we know about genetics. He knew nothing. I mean, literally nothing about genetics. They talked about heredity in those days. They didn't know about genes. Gregor Mendel, in Darwin's lifetime, came up with discovered genes, a particulate theory of genetics. But in Darwin's day, he was operating with a theory of heredity called blending inheritance. It was sort of assumed that the reason offspring kind of looked like both of their parents is that it was like mixing two different colored paints, and the offspring was sort of some blending, had a blending of the traits. So you've got your mother's eyes, but you've got your father's nose, or something like that. This was sort of the model. Okay. Now, when Darwin put forward the theory of natural selection, he had a problem, and he knew he had a problem. And the problem was this: if an organism is born that has a favorable variant, and he didn't know about mutations at that point, they were called just variants or sports. That was the term that they used. If an organism was born that had a favorable variant that could be selected in an environment because it was conducive to leaving more surviving offspring, that was all well and good. But the problem is, with whom is that individual with the favorable variant going to breed? Well, there's only one of it. Exactly. There's only one of it and a vast number of normals, so to speak. It's going to breed with one of the normals. And under the theory of blending inheritance, what's going to happen is the offspring are going to be 50% of the way back to normal in the very next generation. And in the generation after that, it's going to happen again and again and again. And so the idea was that a favorable variant, if it arose, would get diluted, swamped out. And so there could not be this accumulation. Now, this objection was made very pointedly by a mathematician named Fleming Jenkins in Darwin's day. And he proved categorically that, because based on their theory of inheritance operative at the time, natural selection was impossible. This could not be the method by which evolution worked. And Darwin was at terrible pains to figure this out, and he had to backpedal. He wrote 6 versions of 6 editions of The Origin of Species. I've read every one of them, and in every edition he has to backpedal and back away from this problem. He doesn't know how to get around it. He eventually resolves it. Well, there must be something called assortative mating, where the ones that have the favorable variants seek each other out. In the end,
kind of an ad hoc.
Yeah, it was completely ad hoc, and he knew it was wrong. He even said, "I know it can't be right, but this is the only way I could salvage the theory." So, but he thought there were independent reasons for. He thought he'd established the fact of evolution. The question that was at issue now was the mechanism. Is the mechanism right? This was a challenge to the mechanism. Now, as it turned out, Mendelian genetics came along. It was rediscovered in the early 1920s and. Well, actually, around 1900 and the 1920s and 30s, there was this modern synthesis where they figured out genetics and all that, and Darwin's theory was vindicated. But I mean, this was someone torpedoing a theory, and although it turned out to be wrong, that torpedo turned out to be misguided, okay, because it was operating under the principle of blending inheritance also. This was a huge thing. This was someone really was coming up with a legitimate criticism of the theory, given what they understood at the time. And it could be that Berlinski has absolutely legitimate theories, even though he's working outside the field, and the theory might ultimately be vindicated, or his objections might be vindicated. So the fact that I don't know what his views are, and I really don't care. So I'm interested in looking at them and considering them. And I don't know. I mean, I don't have a background in mathematics, so I might not be qualified to understand him any better than Dr. Jones is. So I'll just have to wait and see, and I'll let you know what I think when I've looked at it.
What I was saying, though, I wanted to qualify here. The statement I was saying about him having a background in philosophy and mathematics doesn't mean that he cannot bring anything useful to the table, and I agree with you that there's a lot of that cross-checking and using multiple disciplines to verify things is extremely important. So even by using or having mathematicians examine the theory and different I talked earlier about multiple fields examining things, and the more ways we can do it, the better, the more confidence we can have. So I agree with that. But what I'm, I guess, getting at with his situation, given that he studied mathematics and philosophy, and that's where his primary credentials lie, but then his primary focus is on the theory of evolution in criticizing it, the first thing that I am going to do as a skeptic is verify that he accurately understands the theory of evolution before.
I agree.
That's all I meant with that, is that it's we can't just accept his credentials in saying that he understands it. Now, that's where I mentioned Dr. Jerry Bergman from the debate earlier. He actually has a PhD in molecular biology, and he's a legitimate scholar that believes in a young Earth creation. It just blows my mind that that's the case, but it's I know that at least he understands the theory of evolution correctly, or was able to fake that long enough to get his credentials.
I'd like to
I can bring up.
There is something that really concerns me. Dr. Lennox, he's a brilliant mathematician. Richard Dawkins had a wonderful conversation with him, and the thing that really did raise a lot of red flags for me was Dr. Lennox, as brilliant as he is in math, when it came to theology, he was not working with any rational models, that is, of the text itself. And so he was just pulling things out of the air, not to say that all theology isn't, or all theologians are not. My point is, sometimes we as theists, what we do is we try to get these brilliant people and we try to pull them into our camps, and we try to use these brilliant people to preach our doctrine in a sense. I don't know that this is happening with Dr. Berlinski, but I do want to be fair. I want to respect this gentleman. I think he's a very intelligent person. But I would like for someone who can speak to what he is actually saying, actually explain many things about what he is suggesting. And I'd like to see someone push back.
I think one of the reasons the Discovery Institute likes him is because he's an agnostic, so they can kind of put him forward as an example of, oh, hey, you don't have to, there's intelligent design, it's not religious, you can be, atheists have a problem with it too, or agnostics, whatever.
That's in fact true, though.
Yeah, I know, but most of the people defending it are religious.
But
Sure.
we have to be honest about this. If he doesn't have to be a theist, but if he wants to sell a lot of books, and he does oppose evolution, and he does have the credentials to be able to push back on this, that is in scientific.
I have to take a more.
I think that he could really make more money with some of these kinds of groups, and I'm not suggesting that that's what he should do, but there's a hell of a lot of money to be made if you're trying to push back on something like this. But go ahead, Greg.
I have to take a more charitable approach to the people that are in this. Is that I look at some of these televangelists making the $8 million compounds, and there's been NPR did a great investigative story about like the top 5 televangelists and their organizations this last week. They were, or it was all over. But I have to say, for people like Berlinski and other scholars, for anybody who's ever really been a scholar, I'm sure that most of the people here can attest to this. You don't go into it for the money. It's to get a PhD is something that takes a massive amount of time and determination, and generally, unless you're going into something like a PhD in chemistry, where you, or maybe something that would be immediately applicable in the industrial world, you're expecting to teach or to research, to teach and research, and to not make a whole lot of money. I mean, we're talking less than 6-figure salaries, or right around there for sort of the maximum, the amount being made is $100,000 to $150,000 for even the top schools. So yes, selling books can certainly do, or supplement that income and be good for you. But I can't imagine anybody going into this and writing all these books and doing all this if they didn't honestly, passionately believe what they're saying. I just think that it is better sometimes to consider how this gives evidence that even the most intelligent, educated, sophisticated, erudite among us are still capable of believing all sorts of weird stuff. And sometimes there's actually been studies that have looked into how intelligence relates to sort of wild beliefs, and it turns out that intelligence correlates pretty strongly with confidence in your own beliefs when you have that. I mean, there's of course the Dunning-Kruger effect, so that goes the opposite direction in that respect. But there's a confidence once you have established something that a lot of the most ardent conspiracy theorists and other various, I guess, for lack of a better term, nutters out there, are people that are actually quite intelligent and have done a fair amount of research that they're understanding. They're just really bad at selecting unbiased sources and at controlling for their own confirmation bias. So
intelligence is often, I think, misunderstood. Intelligence, the capacity to wrestle with a problem or a type of pattern or a particular aptitude is not the same thing as thinking clearly or understanding one's psychological motivation. I really think that when it comes to many of the biases of all of us, these biases are something that is really independent of our intelligence, that our intelligence merely gives to us a capacity to deal with something and be able to hold it in your hand, as it were. But it doesn't really apply to the clarity or the accuracy of the kind of thinking you then employ.
Yeah, I would agree. One of the things about one of the marks of intelligence is ingenuity and creativity, the ability to come up with possible explanations, alternative explanations, and of course, if you are beholden to a certain conclusion, you can press your intelligence so that it's in service of a particular conclusion. There's a journalist by the name of Jonathan Kay, I think his name, wrote a book I read a short time ago called Among the Truthers. He was looking at people who believe in, 9/11, conspiracies and others, and he sort of found a very strong correlation between people who were really quite exquisitely intelligent and well educated, and firm conviction in a lot of really weird conspiracies. And it's because these people are really good. People who are intelligent are really good at convincing themselves of something, rationalizing something, explaining something away, finding a putative explanation that will preserve something that they already are committed to, perhaps for not very good reasons in the first instance. But nevertheless, you can shore up a belief that should have fallen away a long time ago by virtue of being intelligent. So it is by no means correct to say that if someone believes something that by your lights seems completely cracked, that they're stupid, or even that they're irrational. I mean, they might have, by their lights, come up with genuinely good arguments, but just a subtle error somewhere along the way could set you on the wrong track. And then you really are on rails and going in the wrong direction, and there's almost no way to sort of reason your way out of that at that point. It's very, very hard. It can be done, but it's very difficult.
We have ran, we're way over time, and
yeah,
so
can I make one final point on that?
You can. I'll give you the chance to in just a second. But when I was stating something about Dr. Berlinski writing in the context for money, I think that his work is not so much for money, but I think that if you want to sell the book, the product that is, and you're writing trying to push back on evolution, theists have a great track record with a certain book. It's been marketed as the bestseller of all time. And if you want to sell your book, sometimes aligning yourselves with different people, not because you believe what they say to be true, might be a good strategy, that is, to market your book. That's all I meant by that.
The enemy of my enemy is my friend there? Is that what you're getting at?
I was not trying to suggest that he was trying to do something in a negative sense. But go ahead, Greg. Final thoughts, and we've got to go.
The other thing that I wanted to say, just to add on to what Ozzy was just saying, is that intelligence, it's kind of a vicious cycle in that it often is related to the ability to argue well. Not just creativity, but the ability to convince other people that you're right. And there is nothing more satisfying in many ways for your own beliefs, or more reinforcing of them, than being told you're right and convincing other people that you're right that disagreed with you in the past. It's something that it's, as I become more and more experienced with argumentation and debate, I find that it's become pretty easy for me to convince people of things that are that just have never really argued about them or debated them in the past, and I always have to check for that, and like, oh, well, that doesn't mean that I'm right. It just means that they are easily convinced because they're not really exposed to it, and that's again, the people who aren't willing to check for that, or as diligent about checking for that, it's really easy to let that go to your head and make you think, oh, well, look how convincing it is. There's dozens of people that.
Highly intelligent people can also work themselves deeper into various different emotional and psychological disorders, because they can really spin the maladaptive approaches that lead to those disorders in an amazing way.
Right. Well, we are out of time for now. We will be back tonight at 8 o'clock, and the conversation will be intense, because we are going to be looking at all different kinds of modeling, and hopefully we can make sense of it. And if you think that we can't, contact someone who can join us who can. Thank you for your time. Bye-bye.